thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.
Well, hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the helpful things that we're talking about today. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any conversations. And today, we're wrapping up our discussion about faith deconstruction. This last weekend, I got the chance to be in Wisconsin, which was fun, to really host a Q&A discussion with our lead pastor, Mark Weigt. And during that conversation, which you can catch on YouTube or on this podcast, we discussed the faith deconstruction questions that people wrote in. Now, we didn't get a chance to cover everything or really answer them all, maybe as in-depth as we would have loved to. And so Mark was actually gracious enough to give us another little discussion session for the podcast. So this is my conversation with Mark, chatting about your faith questions. Well, hey, Mark, thanks for, it was real quick. We saw each other just a little bit ago, but thanks for coming back on the podcast.
The hot seat is never done.
Like I mentioned in the intro, we are going over some of the questions that we talked about in, our Q&A discussion session. And the cool thing was that so many people came in with questions and we weren't able to get to all of them. Or frankly, I think also just like answer some of them maybe with more time, because I think you're trying to get through all these questions and I'm sure after these questions have been asked, you've had a chance to like, oh man, when we said that, I wish I would have said this part too, the part of that little hot seat formula. And so I'm curious, as we're jumping off here, was there any questions that you got a chance to answer that you're like, I wish I also would have added this to my answer, or I wish I could have shared this as well?
Well, first off, I think anytime you try to, some of those questions are, they're messages or two in themselves. Okay. So, politics, the topic of hell and science, just those three alone. They're like, they're incomplete when you answer something in 5 to 6 minutes. Okay. So yeah, and all of them, yes, there were some things. I think you go back. I think one of the ones that I thought about some more is the political question.
Yeah, tell me about that.
And I didn't want to leave the impression that politics weren't important. And I would encourage people, and I don't think I encourage this enough or stress this enough, that, hey, it's important to have the right leaders in place. All right. It's important to have good leaders in place. That I would encourage you to vote and to serve and to enlist and to run if you want. Okay. Yeah. All those things. And I don't think I stressed that enough, but what I really wanted to stress were two things. One, do it with a posture of humility and gentleness and grace. Okay. You can be a firm, decisive leader and still have those characteristics. The other thing is that Andy Stanley said this. I thought this was really wise. He said, the Pledge of Allegiance says one nation under God. But what can often happen is, because of what we talked about during that question, was we put God under nation. And when we put God under nation, bad things happen. And it just gets us in that cycle and all that stuff. And so just to make sure that your filter in your politics is follower Jesus first, politics second, third, fourth, or wherever that may be, but don't put it first, because at the end of the day, hope in a political party isn't going to get you what you're looking for. So I think that was one that stood out to me.
Yeah, I'm curious. I didn't get a chance to follow up with this question, but I wanted to. I wrote it down on my notepad while we were up there. How do you know? Like, how do you have like an internal test? Like, how do you start to like realize that? Because I think that it's one thing to be like, oh yeah, definitely. Like, I know these people, they totally do that. And then maybe yourself, like your own self is like the most guilty of that. Is there any like, I don't know, because I'm sure you've had moments. I know I've had moments where I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I wonder if I've gotten too into this point or that point or.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I think when you start getting personal, that's a sign for me. Okay. When you can't filter out, the party platform or even raising it above higher than that and going, oh yeah, that's because they want to do X, Y, and Z. And and you start getting personal and you start saying, well, all those Democrats or all those Republicans or, hey, those idiots. And, you start getting to that level.
Yeah.
And you get angry with it. That's a sign of hold back up a little bit. Now, once again, it's okay. There's a righteous anger when it comes to protecting the vulnerable and the oppressed and the forgotten and the outcast. Okay, there's a little difference there. But for most of us, our anger isn't at that. It's disagreements in policy stuff or positions on things and things like that. But that's a huge litmus test. When I see Christians responding and they're getting personal and they're unleashing on social media and all that stuff, that to me is a sign.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a whole nother episode. You could probably do a whole episode on political social media, just like that whole jumble of stuff.
Well, it's a wisdom. And the thing is, John, it's a wisdom thing. The one thing I didn't get to read was there's this passage in 1 Timothy. Gosh, it's chapter 3 or 4? I can't remember which one, where Paul kicks off the chapter, and it's such a convicting thing. It's a passage that I always laugh because no Christian quotes this passage that's really politically passionate. They don't, because it is in such contradiction to how they're living their life. And Paul pretty much says, here's what I want you to do as a Jesus follower: pray for all kings and those in authority. And it's kind of like, okay, he was talking about probably back then praying for Emperor Nero, who was frying Christians. He was burning them at the stake. Okay. And he's going, hey, I want you to pray for them, pray for those in authority. And then, and so for us, it would be like, hey, if you're a Democrat, when's the last time you prayed for a Republican, whatever, whether it be president or Congress, whatever it may be. And then vice versa, of course. And then he goes, hey, live quiet and peaceful lives in all godliness, which means like God. Okay. In other words, that's how God kind of treats things. And then he says, this pleases God. And it's just this fascinating thing to go, oh, so means when we're going off on social media and we're going off here and going off there and getting personal and all that stuff, that really doesn't please God. And Paul's going, yeah, it doesn't. And here's one of the biggest reasons why: we sacrifice our influence. Yeah. And once you sacrifice your influence at that altar, you don't get it back.
Yeah. I wonder if this also brings in just like a general life principle, particularly if somebody's like in the process of deconstructing and they're really wrestling with their faith and they see things that Christians are doing. That's like, frankly, I think it's helpful to know, just because a Christian is doing something doesn't mean that that's what all people who follow Jesus are supposed to be doing. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like there's this representation of, well, that means that Jesus would have been, or Jesus is. And it's like, well, sometimes people are flawed, right? And so they have a bad representation of Jesus, just like anything else.
Well, if you're already looking for a reason not to, all right, that's just another, well, there you go. I told you so. And the other thing with that is it doesn't take a strong person to do what everybody else is doing. It just doesn't. And so some people would say, oh, yeah, hey, by treating with humility and grace and gentleness, I mean, that's just weakness. No, actually, that's strength, because that takes a really strong person to go, I'm not going to get sucked into that vacuum.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be very decisive, but in this way, and I'm going to lead in this way, and I'm going to influence in this way. That takes a very strong person to do.
Mark, we didn't get a chance. I think this actually connects pretty nicely with the question we didn't actually get a chance to talk about. Mel, I'll just read the question for you. So this person said, I walked away from a church after being judged unfairly by people there. Why should I ever consider going again? It doesn't look like things have changed. People who say they go to church don't treat people like Jesus described.
Ooh, man, I hate hearing stories like that. I mean, pretty tough. Now, obviously, I don't know the full story. Okay. So I'm answering this question with limited information.
Yeah.
But if this person, I'm assuming, okay, if this person came in and, let's just say they came in and they had certain things about their life, that this is where they are at this point. And the church judged them for being where they are and not being where they could be, and then give them that chance. Oh yeah. I don't blame them for walking away. I don't, because I would tell this person, there are churches out there, and it's a beautiful thing that you can come as you are and go, man, this is just where I am right now. And I don't know what to do, but I just know that God has better. That you can walk into those churches and they go, hey, welcome to the club. We're all a work in progress. We all have stuff and junk. And because of my story, you know what? I can extend grace to you because of your story. And together as a community, God's working in our lives. And together, we're going to be a part of experiencing the better that God has for us. It's a beautiful thing. You're fully accepted and you're fully loved and you experience God through others in that type of environment. It's awesome. It's great.
Yeah. So there's two sides of this, right? There's the person being judged and the person judging. There are the people judging. And I love that you tackle the person being judged right away with that, like, hey, it's okay. Try out somewhere else. I think that's a great encouragement. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts for the people who maybe are the ones judging?
Well,
I'm sure you have plenty.
Yeah. Well, it's easy. It's really easy to judge.
Yeah.
It really is. Because when we judge, we take the spotlight off ourselves and put it on other people.
Mm-hmm.
And what often happens when we judge, especially with certain things, when you get very specific, because a lot of times with people, they judge really harshly for specific things. And a lot of time, the specific things they judge are the very things they deal with and wrestle with in their own lives. And so it is this reaction to that a lot of times, to just what's going on in their own life. Now, let's just say it's not. I would say this: look at the fruit of what you're doing. And if it's a lot of times people judge, are like, well, I'm just telling them the truth. Yep, that's not the goal. The goal is not to tell them the truth. The goal is to be used by the Holy Spirit to create an environment for them to respond to the truth. And so telling isn't the main goal. The response is the goal. And if they respond with no, and you've created an environment of grace where truth can be heard, okay, that's fine. But if you've skipped the grace part and you went right to the truth part and you wonder why people are running, that's on you. That's on you.
Yeah. I think this is a great chance to reflect on the question, what's my role in this situation? And I think there's a tendency to think through well, I think my role is to correct this person, which doesn't even go into the unconscious judging that we do, right? But it's if you're telling somebody where they've done wrong or things like that, it's man, do you have a real relationship with this person where you've earned the right to talk to them about that?
Well, not even that, John. It's if you look at the Apostle Paul. Yeah. I think this is, and once again, this is something that a lot of Christians don't talk about, but let's just say that person isn't a Jesus follower. And the church is famous for speaking into things, into culture, and first off, they aren't following Jesus. So Paul, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 9, roughly in that area. He says, judge those on the inside, not on the outside. And I think the reason he says that is because it's the idea of, hey, if I haven't agreed to do something, or to follow a certain way of life, why are you judging me for something I haven't agreed to? And the reality is, the first step is agree to do it. And then the judging, and judging is a terrible way. Hey, being accountable and striving for better. And to really
what's the difference between those things? Because I think most of us would be like, oh yeah, it's really easy to we say, not judging someone, that sounds great. But then it's wait a minute, what do you mean this accountability? Or what is that separator?
Accountability in a Christian sense, I think, is a wonderful thing. Most Christians don't have it because that means they have to really look at some of these areas of their life and go, no, these need to be addressed. Okay. So accountability is this idea of you're in a relationship, you're in community with others, and it may be a smaller group, like 2 or 3.
Sure.
You're in community with others. And you talk about some of these areas, sins in your life, just areas where God's just really working on your heart. And you go, hey, I want you to hold me to this. And then there's this, okay. And so there's this loving exchange that goes on to go, how are you doing here? And if you're not doing well, okay, why not? Hey, how can I help? How can I pray for you? Hey, I'm going to keep asking you about this. Hey, I'm going to show up here. I'm going to encourage this. That's the sort of thing that's just a beautiful thing about Christian community. It really is. That's accountability. Judgment is, why do you keep doing this? You suck. And God's mad at you. And that's kind of the judgment thing. It's just loaded with shame.
Assigning value based on those decisions and all those types of things.
Loaded with shame.
So this may be a super tricky question, and you can stop me if we're getting too in the weeds on this, but I'm curious, like maybe somebody's gotten that, they had that accountability in their life. And frankly, their response was, well, I just kind of want to keep doing what I'm doing. You know what I mean? Like, is there, I don't even know what the question is for that, Mark, but like, is that like, if somebody's hearing that and they're like, man, how do I wrestle through that? If somebody gives me that hard accountability conversation, how do I discern whether, you know what, like this is real and I really need to take it at face value, or do I need to reevaluate and be like, no, I'm just being judged? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of times when we're justifying a certain behavior, we'll call it judgment when someone calls, because we're so dug in and we kind of want to distance ourselves from what we know is right. Yeah. And then so when someone shines the light on it, we're like, no. We just call it judgment. And it's not judgment. We just don't want anything to do with it. And we want to justify what we're doing. I would say this, if you know you're doing it, and it's tough because we've all done this. All right. So we've all done this. I think the thing to do is ask yourself, why? What's the real reason? When I say that, what's the real reason why you would justify stepping away from something that's not God's best for you? And most of the time it's feelings based, it's fear based. It's one of those two, and that we think it's going to lead us to a better place. And here's the thing. It might in the short term, but in the long term, it'll eventually blow. It always does. Yeah.
And that may require, Mark, getting a chance to talk through some of those emotions with somebody, you know,
I would agree.
If emotions are holding you back on those things, you can go to counseling, talk to a close friend, and like, gosh, if fear is that element, it's like, I'm afraid of what I'll lose or whatever, work through that with somebody, you know?
I think that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. So, man, this is such a great question. I'm kind of sad that I didn't make it its way in. And I'll paraphrase this a little bit, but it said, this person wrote in, I'm terrified to start following Jesus. What if I start following him and I still feel alone?
Man, that's such a great question.
Yeah.
That's really good. I would first say this, if you have something that scares you about taking the step to follow Jesus, that is 100% normal. I haven't talked to anybody that at least, sometimes it's a long time or a short period of time, but it is a time.
Yeah.
There's certain things that just keep them from taking that step. And so the fact that you've acknowledged that and you know what it is fantastic. I think that's really great. Here's what I would encourage you to do. I would encourage you to take the step, because what we do is we want the answer to our fear first before we take the step of faith. Yeah. And the way that God works is we take the step of faith and then we get the answer to our fear. So it just kind of works in reverse. And that's part of the faith step, to going, God, I really trust you. Okay. Yeah. And so that's hard. And so you just got to realize that. And then the second thing is this, is as you take that step, get connected in community right away. Okay. Just get connected in community right away, because here's what will happen. Community, the root for community is common. And what's really cool is all of a sudden you meet this group of people and you go, oh, all this is in common. And that loneliness begins to subside.
Awesome. Okay. So next question. This is a fun one. You can have as much fun as you want with this one. Do you agree with hate the sin, but love the sinner?
Do I agree with it? I understand why people say it. Okay.
Sure. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's good.
But do I agree with it? I do not. And the reason I don't agree with it is because when you say that to someone, they don't separate it. All right. Now we try to do it because we have to figure out, how do we live in the tension of this person is engaging in certain behavior, whatever it might be, sinful activity.
Yeah.
And how do I wrestle with being in a relationship or whatever it may be? Okay. And so we come up with little lines like that to go, oh, here's how I make it work. Here's how I justify it.
Yeah.
The reality is that first, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. If we just put this in God's perspective for a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
And let's just say all of us, if you're a Jesus follower, we've engaged in certain behaviors and stuff like that. And can you imagine God going, I love the sinner, but I hate his sin. God just, I love my boy and I love my girl. Man, I love my son and I love my daughter. And you know what? I love them so much. I'm going to work on that part of their life. And because I've got better for them. So if God has that view of us, why would we look at a different view of others? And once again, I just think it comes back to we're just uncomfortable with what to do with that. And so we try to separate them into categories, and they're not. If you ever say that to someone, they go, so in other words, you hate me?
Yeah.
That's what they're thinking. That's what they're thinking. So I don't agree with it.
Yeah. I mean, that really goes into the whole principle of, how do you love somebody well? And I think that very rarely will you find you're loving somebody well when you don't react to maybe the things that they do that are hurtful to them or to others with almost like a grieving or like man, I want something more for you, right? Yeah. Rather than a grab my pitchfork, right, and go after, you know what I mean? Like that separator.
Well, if I said that to you, let's just, you have a good friendship. If I said to you, well, John, you know what? I love you, but I hate your sin, or I hate that sin in your life. I mean, what would your reaction be to that?
It wouldn't be positive.
No. And we have a relationship together. So, I mean, it's just, again, it's, I mean, this, I think we just try to, how do we live in that tension?
Yeah.
And people, once again, love people first. And what does it mean to love well, like you said?
So this next question has to do with family, and I think particularly has to do with, man, what if you and your family don't agree on faith elements? This is what this person says. My family always wants to argue about their faith or about specific parts of the Bible, and it's impacting my own faith. I would assume negatively. What do I do?
Well, what I would tell you to do, and what you can probably do are two different things. Okay. That's unfortunate, because I think when you're around a Christian who loves to just get into arguments and debates and discussions, and the other person doesn't want to, it's a tough thing, especially, I mean, if you've tried to set boundaries with them, and I'm assuming you have, and if you haven't, you should just say, hey, listen, here's what's okay with me, and here's what's not okay with me, and get specific on what those are to set boundaries. And if you've done that and they've continued to break the boundaries, I don't blame it. I don't blame you for struggling with your own faith with it. But here's what I would encourage you to do. Don't hinge your faith on what someone else does or says. Okay? Because once we do that, I'm struggling with my own faith because what so-and-so does. Well, hopefully your faith is not built on what someone else says or does. Hopefully it's built on the resurrection of Jesus. And constantly go back to that. And I would just once again encourage you, and this sounds like the cliche answer, but it's just really, really important. Throughout the Bible, we see this phrase, stand firm, persevere, okay. In other words, these things are going to try to shake our faith up in these different situations we have in life and all that stuff. So put yourself in a position that you're connected with other Jesus followers. And you can share this with them, a smaller group, and they can help you as you're struggling through some of these things, but stay connected to other people.
I think this goes back to this principle. We've talked about this before, Mark, where it's like, every once in a while you'll get somebody who maybe they're questioning their faith, or they're like really deconstructing, or maybe they even fully, they decided to walk away from Jesus. And it was because of some intellectual thing. Like maybe very rarely you'll hear that. But honestly, for the most part, usually it's because of the people that they were interacting with, either treating them poorly or having disagreements, and then it kind of just led to a spiral.
Yeah, it's personal lifestyle. It's personal and lifestyle choices are the two main reasons people that their Jesus followers deconstruct and walk away.
Yeah,
that's by far the most.
Yeah.
Now there can be also wrong expectations in there. Okay, they had these certain expectations of what it means to follow Jesus. All of a sudden, oh man, life didn't turn out, and my expectations weren't met. Oh, this doesn't work, and then they walk away. That's the third one, but the first two are big.
Hey, tell me about that, because I'm sure that there's people listening right now that maybe that's their story, and maybe they didn't write in a question or anything about like, oh yeah, my expectations, I didn't get what I thought Jesus would be, but maybe a phrasing would be like, I don't know, hey, I tried the Jesus thing and it didn't work.
Yeah, I think the wrong expectations thing is huge, because if I talk to most people and I said, okay, hey, you're following Jesus, what do you think the goal is? Okay, what do you think the end result is? I get two answers. one, get to heaven. Okay, that would be the other one. And then the second one would probably be something along the line of, now they wouldn't necessarily say this directly, but this is what they would really mean. It would be, so I'd live a better life where things would turn out, I get my prayers answered and just, kind of all that stuff. You might throw in fire insurance and there's some people would, do that, but I think that would be the top two. The struggle with it doesn't work is usually a couple things. One, there's this formula of expectations and experience equal contentment. And so when those two match, experience and expectations match, you get contentment, or you get, joy, peace, whatever that may be, whichever one you want to fill in there. So most people have this expectation that Jesus is supposed to, no pain, no problems. Everything's supposed to turn out right. Life should get easier. Life should, quote unquote, everything get better. And then when that doesn't happen, our experience doesn't play that out, we get discontent or disappointed or discouraged. And so as a result, we walk away. But Jesus never promised that. He even said it, in this world, you'll have trouble. He will. I mean, all of his friends bolted on him and he got nailed to a cross. So we follow a crucified savior.
Yeah.
So, I mean, right there, we should know. And he talks about, man, the gates of Hades will not stand against. In other words, there's a battle out there going on. And we minimize that, but man, that's true. Anything to tip us off and to knock us away from our faith, there's an enemy that's trying to do that. So you get that part, wrong expectations. The other part is many people get disappointed with following Jesus is because they have what I call a hybrid approach to following Jesus. It's like, okay, I follow Jesus, but I keep doing what I was already doing. And then I bring Jesus in there and I do what Jesus wants me to do when it matches what I'm already doing. And so they have this hybrid approach. And here's the thing. Jesus didn't come to follow us. We're supposed to follow him. In other words, he's king of our life. And with him being king of our life, we put everything under his authority, not his stuff, not our stuff, and that we ask him to go under our authority. And so that won't work every single time because Jesus just won't bend to that.
Yeah. That's really good. Mark, as you're sharing especially the expectation stuff, I just wrote down this question. I think that part of the challenge with people may be in terms of how they hear or learn about following Jesus, right? And so I think that there is a little bit of like, hey, when people start sharing things like, hey, you just got to have enough faith and then that prayer will come true. You know what I mean? Or like, well, you must not have, like there's lots of prayer ones. There's lots of, God won't give you any more than you can handle. There's lots of things that people might say and they mean it so well. They mean well. They want to be encouraging. They want to like lift somebody's spirits, but it creates those wrong expectations, right?
Yeah. And everything happens for a reason. Okay. We throw that one out all the time. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, I heard this story the other day where, I've seen this story many times. Okay. So someone was sick, we pray for God to heal them. Okay. Cause we do, we just, we pray for God to heal them.
Yeah.
They died. Okay. They died. And so now it's like, where was God and all that stuff? And there's anger and hurt and all that stuff. Okay. First off, God doesn't, we're just called to pray for the sick and ask God to heal. We're not told he's going to answer every one of them. And so then that happens and we don't know what to do, but if we just understand like, hey, we ask God, God may not answer everything, but he may. All right. But if he doesn't, what do we do with that? Does that mean God's not there? God doesn't care? No, it just means sometimes it's things that we can't explain. We don't understand. We're not God, but here's what we can do. We invite God into the pain. We invite God into it. We lament and we grieve. We experience God and we go from there. Because that's the thing he promises only, that he'll be there for us no matter what.
Gosh, that speaks to your earlier comments on community, doesn't it? Where it's like when you have those moments, you kind of have two routes to go down. You have the bitterness, the blame, which frankly makes sense. Like I understand why people go down those routes, but having people in your life that can be like, hey, you know what? Let's grieve this. Let's process these hard things in a good way,
Yeah. Well, I think you've seen this, John. I mean, most of us have what's called circumstantial faith. So if my circumstances are good, God's good. If my circumstances aren't good, God's not good. And eventually we got to get to a place in our faith journey as we mature to go, oh, hey, wait a minute. That's not what this is about. This is about God and trusting his leadership in our life because of who he is. And no matter what happens to us, he's always good. He's always good.
Hey, Mark, this might be a curveball, but when I was researching the deconstruction stuff, something that I read about was people feeling like, just maybe in terms of how God was described or whatever, like, do I really want to worship like a quote egotistical God, right? Where he's like wants all this praise and things like that. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. Do you think God is egotistical?
Do I think God is egotistical?
Yeah.
I don't. Worship is anything we ascribe worth to. Okay. So the thing is that we all worship something. We do because we are human beings and we ascribe worth to something. So here's the thing. We already are worshiping all those other things outside of God, let's just say. John, you worship the Seattle Seahawks. And which, they're actually pretty good. Okay, but let's just say you do. And here's the thing. So you're ascribing worth to them, but here's what you're going to find out. There's going to be something very empty about that because of what you're subscribing that type of worth to isn't worth that. It'll fall short. So when we say the worship of God, what we're doing is we're saying we're ascribing worth to the only one that is worth worshiping. And so God doesn't go, oh, I just need this to, feel better about myself. No. What he is doing is, and when we do that, we are first off, it's for us. And it's us acknowledging who is the only one that's worthy. It's ascribing the worth that's deserved to the only one that's deserving of it. And there's just something about that where just life begins to make sense when that happens. So it's not an egotistical thing. It's a perspective and a priority thing. And this is how we were meant to live. It really is. So we're going to do it. I just think we should do it to the only one who deserves it.
That's really good. I haven't heard it described that way. That's like, I love the assigning worth and God recognizing that, hey, when you do this, it's actually better for you. I'm not here just being like, wow, Tina didn't say this, you know what I mean? It's like,
sorry. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, we look at Jesus and we see what the Father is like. Okay. Yeah. And I don't think any of us would look at Jesus and go like, man, he had such a big ego.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
It's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite.
All right. Let's see. Okay. So this is a question that I think is based upon something we talked about, but we didn't get a chance to, I think, dive into it maybe a little bit more. And that's the idea of like on science. I'm curious because I was right now as you were talking, writing down the questions. As we think and we talk about science, one, was there anything that maybe you mentioned having a conversation with me with somebody talking about science and miracles? Do you want to share that?
Yeah. So I think we talked about this in one of the services, okay? Because the science question brought up in both. That the question was about miracles, and I said, so miracles are anything outside the natural order.
Yeah.
So science would say impossible, can't happen. And I was walking out of the 9:00 service, the first service, and I was talking to a guy that goes to our church. Wonderful. I mean, just wonderful guy who's a brain surgeon. And he says to me, he goes, man, I wish I would have gotten that question. And I said, I do too. And he said, no, he said, I see in what I do. He goes, and other doctors, okay. He goes, we see more things happen that we can't explain than we'd like to admit. And he goes, someone like me, we could say miracles do happen because we see them quite often. We can't explain them, even in the job that we're doing. And so I said to him, just kind of branch off into an interesting conversation because this helps the science conversation as well, John.
Yeah.
Is I said, well, tell me why, because I know there's a lot of Christian scientists out there. He goes, yeah, that's right. And I said, tell me why there's also a high percentage of scientists that just refuse to go there. And he said, man, that's a great question. And he said, I think for some, it's just the starting spot. And then, what that'll mean for them if they do start there. And then I said to him this, I said, John, I said this person, I said, is the other part of that because there's just been some Christian scientists and apologetics who have just drawn the line in the sand of things that just don't matter. And so it's turned them off a bit. And for example, well, the earth has to be 6,000 years old. Well, I mean, they've drawn the line and said, well, if you don't say it's 6,000 years old, then, you can't be I just, once again, I just don't think it's that important. Evolution, secular evolution, different category, but there's different categories of evolution. And so for some of them, the Christian scientists, you can't believe in any form of evolution. Okay, well, that's going to turn them away. And so they're going, from an intellectual standpoint, I can't go there because they're not credible. Once again, there are some things with evolution that we see that could very well be possible. I mean, people are getting bigger than they were 100 years ago. All right. Doesn't mean they came from apes. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, we see some things evolving that we can't deny. So you can believe in aspects of evolution and still be a Christian. It's okay. But once again, we were just talking about how some Christian scientists have turned away some of these scientists from the very thing. But the miracle thing, very real.
That's really good. I think there's an element too. I can't remember if we chatted about this during services, but I think there are times where people in the Christian faith will latch on to their understanding of what maybe science is saying versus what people in the science community are actually saying, and they'll try to defeat, I call them like little straw man arguments, right? Where it's like, well, they think this about this scientific principle. And then, maybe somebody's hearing them say that, right? Particularly amongst my generation and younger, right? Where they just pull out their phone and be like, let's fact check that real quick. And they look it up. And they're like, I'm not sure that that's actually what other people are saying. And you almost lose credibility, right? So I don't know if there's a question in there, Mark, so much as it is.
I think, John, what's interesting about what you're saying is that, as we touched on, there's two things that one, as we touched on, science is goal is something different. It's on the how, and faith is on the why. Yeah. Okay. So that's always got to be the filter. When you're trying to get the why out of the how, let's just say, well, no wonder it doesn't work, and vice versa. Okay. So the goal of science can't be to do faith stuff because it's not set up for that. All right. So I think, once again, that is such an important thing. And I think the other thing when it comes to science is depend on where your perspective is. Let's just say you're an atheist, you're an atheist and you're a scientist, and you're a Christian as a scientist. Because your starting point is different, some of the discoveries that we see, they're going to be explained differently. The same discovery will be explained differently. We see this time and time again because your starting point is different. That's and so, we see that. So if I even Google something and I read it from the AP, oh man, of course, that's going to be a different filter than if you read it from Christianity Today, let's just say. So, I mean, there's that to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I remember learning about some of those elements when I was just studying the different books of the Bibles and who their authorship is, right? Because there's definitely groups, and this may be a huge rabbit trail here, but I promise I'll connect it back. About like authorship, like of certain books of the Bible, and people having questions about those things. And part of their defense, right, particularly when it relates to like maybe that book is talking about something in the future. Mm-hmm. Like a key one is like the fact that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70. And so if there's references to that concept, it's like, oh, it must have been written afterwards.
That's right.
Well, that lens is coming from, well, it couldn't have been a prophecy. Mm-hmm. Right? It couldn't have been talking about the future because it can't have been. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like, I think there's some elements that are similar along that lines. Yeah.
Well, which then leads into, as we talk about some of this deconstruction stuff, it's you got to be a critical thinker. Okay. So let's just say in your example, you throw that out there and you go, the question not is, well, it must have been then written after. The question needs to be, when was it written? Yeah. And how can we find out? And how can we get the most accurate information with that? Because if it was written after, that's going to lead to a different set of questions than if it was written before, rather than making the assumption because of what your bend is, that you already know what the answer is.
You said, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, someone said to me one time, what if they found the bones of Jesus? They said, what would you do? I said, I wouldn't be a Christian and I'd leave my job.
Yeah.
And they said, well, why is that? Why wouldn't you just, I said, because they found the bones of Jesus. That means he didn't resurrect from the dead, and everything is built on that. I'm not just going to believe something because I already have now that bend.
Yeah.
Critically thinking is what I believe is not true. So then I walk away. But that's the critical thinking aspect that's really important.
Yeah, you mentioned some of this in your kind of closing thoughts on the whole deconstruction series, was this idea of being able to deconstruct also what you might be moving to, right? So essentially it's like having kind of an intellectual humility about the whole process. How would you encourage somebody to go through that? Because that was the one thing I didn't really get a chance to follow up with you on. Even in side conversations, how do you deconstruct the stuff that maybe you're moving to, or frankly want to move to, just as much as the stuff you're moving from?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you have to ask yourself, and this is where the intellectual honesty comes in. Yeah. Why are you moving in that direction in the first place? All right. Once again, is it a lifestyle issue? Is there something personal? Is there, wrong expect? Okay. So is there something in there that's causing that?
It may not necessarily be a bad thing, right?
No, it may not be. No, not at all. That's
right.
Okay. That's right.
Yeah.
The other thing is that when you think about some of the things that we move towards, if the majority of culture, here's kind of been my filter. If the majority of culture just accepts it as it is, that's a red flag for me. It's a red flag. And so when the majority goes, I always go, I need to take a look at that more.
Yeah.
And so then what do you do then? You look at certain statements or things, and then you begin to ask yourself either questions, why or how? Why or how? Hey, how does that really work? Why is that statement there? And what I'm saying with that one is it's okay. So for example, we use this example, follow your heart. Okay. It's it's a big thing in culture nowadays. Okay.
I know you love that phrase.
I do. Why is that statement so popular? In other words, or you could say, where did that statement come from? Okay. Maybe that's a better question. And when you do the research on it, because most people are like, oh, that's just kind of always been there and all stuff, man, when you do the research on it, you go, oh, hey, there's a beginning. There's an influencer. There's a reason for the influence. And you start to just unpack the different things with it. And you start to go, I'm buying into a system that really doesn't make sense. In fact, not only does it not make sense, it is leading me down a trail that doesn't end well. And so maybe the better questions, I always ask why, because that's the first one that always comes to my mind, because what's the real reason? And so I'm like, why am I really doing this? But it's the where and then the how. Where and then the how. And the where.
Now, when you say where and then the how, you're talking about for your motivations or for your culture, or is that about the cultural movement?
The cultural, where did it start?
Yeah.
You got to get below the layers on that. Okay. You got to get below the layers. When everyone talks about, progressivism and stuff like that, and take the political stuff. Okay. I'm just talking about the word itself. Okay.
Sure.
It's like, okay, is that really true just because it has that name? Or where did that come from?
Yeah.
And because it's not new. That's the interesting thing. People go, well, it's not new. And there's a beginning point, and it usually goes way back to a certain place. And it's pretty fascinating what you find.
Yeah, I'm curious. And honestly, the answer may be no, but I'm curious if there have been moments where you've even had to be like, man, I feel like this is true. And this feels right. This feels good. And then you're like kind of look into it. You look behind the layers, you're like, wait a minute. Gosh, that's really hard, but I don't think it is true.
No, yeah. I'm a good person is the big one for me. And I used to say this all the time about myself. Okay. I'm a good person. I'm a good person. And I used to say that. And then here was the interesting thing. This is the time before I was following Jesus. And I'd always just, I was doing all this bad stuff. But I'd always just fall back.
I won't make you list it out.
You don't have to go into that. It's a different podcast. But I would say, yeah, but I'm a good person. And so I would say that. And then finally, internally, I'm going like, man, you're a hypocrite. And why do I keep defaulting to that?
Yeah.
So finally, as I began to, I made a decision to follow Jesus and all that stuff. And then I got to this place where I still was using this phrase, I'm a good person. And I finally asked myself, does that make any sense? Because I'm doing all these bad things, but yet I'm defaulting to this. And then I finally asked myself, how do I know that? And why do I think I'm a good person? And what's the reference point? So I asked myself those three questions, and the answers were not good. Especially the reference point. The reference point was, well, because I'm better than so-and-so. And I always picked someone that I thought I did more good things than.
Yeah.
And it's this fascinating thing. And then I was like, and here's the thing. How do I know where do I keep score? Where is the score? Well, the score is in my mind on how I feel. And then I finally got to this place where I realized, like, man, that statement's not true. And then here's the beautiful thing. People go like, well, Mark, what about your self-esteem? And here's the thing. When you get to a place in a statement like that, let's just say, and you deconstruct and you get to a place where you go like, man, that isn't true. Does that mean now all of a sudden I need to seek counseling? Actually, no, it set me free. Because what that statement was doing, it was basically saying, hey, you know what? I don't really need God because I'm a good person. When I realized, like, man, I'm not as good as I think I am. I need help now. Yeah. That made me turn to God more and makes me rely on God more. And so you begin to just see that. And here's the thing. My self-worth now is stronger than ever, even though I don't believe I'm a good person. And so you begin to just kind of see and unpack that. And I know you probably want to dive into the I'm not a good person thing, but no. But you see, but once again,
that's so good. Yeah.
It's there, and we just never think through those statements. And then, well, then you think you're a bad person? Yeah, left to my own devices, I'm going to do what's best for me. And guess what? So will 99.9% of the population.
Yeah.
And it's okay. We need help. We need God.
Man. Yeah. That's really good. I think that's a great reminder that just because we want something to be true does not make it true out of just because we want it to be, or because we feel like it should be that way. There's so many times that I feel like I've been like, oh, I wish it was that way. And so many people wish it was too, but sometimes it's just not.
And you know what? That's actually okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you find freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. Okay. So Mark, I mean, we've gone through multiple messages. We've had, this Q&A, we've had all the hot seat stuff. We've had all this stuff. Like, was there any question left on the table? You're like, man, I couldn't work it into a message. I really wish somebody would have teed me up and I was really going to hit this home run with this answer or something like that. Like, is there any, and maybe it's a closing thought, but maybe it's really just like, hey, was there anything that you really wanted to talk about, but you just didn't get a chance to?
Yeah, I'll hear a lot of people ask me about, they struggle with faith itself. Okay. And what they're talking about is, faith is really just something that's just in their mind. Okay. It's just really a head thing. And so I struggle with faith because, and there's some people that they just think more logical or intellectual. Okay. That's me, honestly. And they really struggle, and they're like, I just feel like I have to check my mind at the door. And they just, so here's what I always ask them. What's your goal? Okay. Because if your goal is certainty, you ain't getting that anywhere. Okay. You can default to science. And it's not certain. If you think science is 100% certain, once again, deconstruct that statement for a minute.
Yeah.
But what is your goal? And I think for most people, they don't realize that there's two aspects to faith. There's a head and a heart component to it. And if you have all head and no heart, you're going to ask yourself questions forever. And if you have all heart and no head, your feelings and emotions are just going to lead you wherever your feelings and emotions are already leading you. There is no guardrails to them, and there's no substance to your faith. And so what I would encourage people to do when they say, I'm struggling with faith. Hey, where is your struggle? What's struggling questions? Well, you know what? I think actually your struggle is with the heart. You haven't engaged your heart in the process yet. And because when we look at knowing, the word knowledge or knowing in the New Testament, it means to personally experience. And so there's a head part of it, but then there's an experiential side of it as well. And so if you're a head person, how can you start to personally experience faith? That's what I always tell people. As you're starting to read the teachings of Jesus, put them into practice. Try them out. And go, okay, God, I don't necessarily agree. I'm just going to start to try. And you start to meet and experience God in those steps. Okay. And then all of a sudden it'll go from up here and it'll start to dip to down here. If you're a feelings-based person, you need to get into environments where you are reading the scriptures and you're starting to learn about God's story and the worldview that God has for you. Because we all come into this with a worldview, and if you do nothing to change that worldview, because that's what Jesus is going to do, he's going to renew our mind. You'll just keep running your faith out of the same mind you had before, and that'll never work long term. So I would just encourage you: is the struggle because of your head, really, or is it really because of your heart? You haven't had the experiences, or is your struggle with too much heart and no head? And no, we need both.
Did you just condense like 7 weeks of message and Q&A into like 2.5? That was good. That was good.
Like I said, I just people struggling with that, and I do too. We just need that. You know, it's a holistic view of faith, not just this part of us or this. It's the holistic view.
Mark, thanks so much. Thanks for answering these questions, for chatting with these things, for doing this whole series. It's been one of my favorite series that we've done, because I think it's been a chance to tackle like hard and real questions that people are really struggling with. So thank you.
Oh, it's been great. And people have just done such a great job. Love the questions, love the engagement. So it's been an honor.
Well, that was my conversation with Mark, and there's so much good stuff in there. You know, my encouragement to you, if you are deconstructing, is really just like Mark's. You know why you're doing it. I think that's super important. But then also don't do it alone. Do it with somebody. Have somebody that can encourage you and pray with you and really wrestle with those questions as you walk through them. If you're looking for more resources on deconstruction, check out our resource page, which is going to be linked in the description. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.